When Peter walks in, he sees something there. When this beloved disciple walks in, you know what he said? Then went in also that other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw, and what? Believed. In verse 7, it says, the napkin that was about his head, in other words, covering his, where the nostrils would be and the mouth. This was the only opening that was left, this area. And this was covered with a cloth-like thing, a napkin, not lying with the linen clothes. It wasn't lying with that in which Jesus had been wrapped, but it was tucked away in a corner, sort of in a nick of the tomb, and it was rolled up, wrapped up, and laid neatly in a place. I've often thought about this. Only God would have someone like Jesus, whom he resurrected, take the time after the resurrection to take that napkin and roll it up so wonderfully and put it up in a little corner by itself. The average person would think, well, if you got up, you just leave everything and get out, right? He didn't do it that way. He wrapped it up, placed it in a nice little place. Only God would act this way. What did they see that caused them to believe? For as yet they knew not the Scriptures, that he must rise again from the dead. He had told them about it, but they did not believe it. They couldn't understand the Scriptures. They didn't understand it. What did they see that caused them to believe? The only thing they could possibly have seen was this empty like cocoon, this wrapping in which his whole body had been encased, with the small aperture, the small opening of the mouth and the eyes. They looked, they saw this thing which had been there for 72 hours. It had hardened. And when they looked at it, there it was. But there was no body in it. There was no Jesus inside. That's what they saw. And that's why they believed. Because had someone stolen the body of Jesus, they couldn't have gotten the body without taking the wrappings along, right? Therefore, the thing that caused Peter and that other disciple to believe that God had raised him from the dead is they saw this in which he was buried was still there, but Jesus wasn't there. You know, my people, the early church did not try, nor did the early church need to prove that Jesus arose from the dead. It was axiomatic. It was a self-evident reality and fact. Why? Because it happened out in the open where everybody could go and see. Can you imagine for 1 minute that Herod wouldn't go? Can you imagine Pilate didn't go? What about the members of the Sanhedrin? What about those who were in government rulership of authority in the government of Rome? What about, because they had officially sealed the tomb? You mean to tell me they wouldn't go? Why, you people even go if something like this occurred in your town. Why? Because of all the great religious leaders in the world. No one had ever gotten up before. Here was the first time that there were all the wrappings and everything else, but there wasn't a body in it. And there's only one thing could have happened, and that is that God must have raised him from the dead. People, this resurrection shook the very foundations of Jerusalem and all the people that lived in that area. It really rocked them. It shook them. And they trounced to that open tomb and that open sepulchre by the thousands. And they looked in, and when they looked in, all they saw was what Peter and that beloved disciple had seen, which caused them to believe. This is why some 50 days later, you will recall on the day of Pentecost when Peter preaches that first sermon, there are about 3,000 souls saved on the first preaching, because this had caused such a great amount of confusion, interest, everything else in that community, that the people were just shook to their very foundation. This resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ is the greatest reality in the world today. And just because somebody comes along and they would say, well, I do not believe that he was resurrected from the dead, I'd like to say to the people who say that the people who lived at that time, who were there, who saw it, are certainly historically more accurate in their presentation than someone living 2,000 or 3,000 years after the incident. Scientifically, their logic would be accepted more so than those living 3,000 years later and denying the reality of the resurrection. But you and I have a proof. We have something in the resurrection which is absolutely indisputable, even in this day and in this hour. And it's some of these things that I want to cover with you tonight in this teaching ministry. I'd like for you to turn to Revelation. The book of Revelation. Chapter 1. What does the resurrection mean to us, to you and to me? Some of these are just little truths, little lights that'll help us to understand a little better. Revelation chapter 1, verse 17. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying unto me, Fear not, I am the first and the last. I am he that what? Liveth, was dead, and behold, I am alive forever, forevermore. And I have the keys of hell and of what? The word hell there is the word Hades, the grave. The keys of the grave and of death. This is something you and I have in the resurrection of Christ. The guaranteed promise. The guaranteed promise of being the victors over the grave and over death. Death is a terrible enemy. The grave is a cold, cold reality. And yet in the resurrection, we have to us the guarantee that he arose, and because he arose, we too are the victors over the grave and over death. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 2, verse 14. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and what? Blood, he also, Jesus Christ himself, likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death, that is, who? The devil. Who has the power of death? Satan, the devil. He's got the power of death. Jesus Christ came, according to the records in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to destroy the works of Satan, to rack and to ruin his kingdom, to utterly paralyze it, as Rotherham puts it. I don't particularly like the word paralyze because I think there's much more to it than just paralyzing. But Rotherham translates this particular verse that through death he might paralyze him that had the power of death, that is the devil. I like much better the accuracy of the King James here where it says that he might destroy him. Utterly not paralyzed, but to destroy him who has the power of death, that is the devil.